Hello friends, I, Dr. Mukund L. Revdiwala, welcome you once again to our class of CC-101 in English Special. As you know, we have been discussing the essays in our paper 101 and that too in unit number 4. In unit number 4 of this paper, you have 10 acquaintances. Out of these 10 acquaintances, there are 5 acquaintances on short story writers, and the other 5 acquaintances are on the essays of the world. Up till now, we have discussed 4 essays, beginning with the French essayist Michel de Montaigne, the pioneer of essay writing in the world literature. Then we talked about Francis Bacon, the father of essay writing in English literature. He was followed by Charles Lamb, and at last we discussed William Hazlitt. Now, the last acquaintance regarding the essays that I am going to discuss is that of R.L. Stevenson. R.L. Stevenson is a Scottish essayist, but he has got a varied talent in his bag. And therefore, I would like to make you understand R.L. Stevenson is a character, R.L. Stevenson is a human being, R.L. Stevenson playing different roles in the field of literature. Let's move to the slideshow of R.L. Stevenson. So let's talk about R.L. Stevenson. As you can see in the slide, R.L. Stevenson was born in 1850 and died in 1894. So it shows that he lived a very short life of only 44 years. There were certain reasons. He was suffering from a disease, and that disease discontinued his journey in life. Let's talk about his education, his growth, his background, and then his literary career. R.L. Stevenson, we have got 2 pictures of the author in his childhood. If you can see, as a child, when he was in his infancy, or rather we can say at a very tender age, in the first photograph you can see he looked like a very cute little baby. And then at the age of 7, we find him a royal kind of dress. So these are the 2 pictures of childhood of R.L. Stevenson. Moving ahead, as I told you in the introduction of R.L. Stevenson, he was a Scottish man, a man belonging to Scotland, almost on the outskirts of England. So Scottish person, and if we try to look at his career, he is a novelist, an essayist, and a poet who contributed several classic works to children's literature. This line indicates that R.L. Stevenson was more interested in writing about children. The full name of R.L. Stevenson is Robert Louis Balfour Stevenson. And he was born on 13th November 1850 in Edinburgh. He studied engineering and then law at the University of Edinburgh. So he was an engineer by education. Of course, as far as his love for his career is concerned, he developed into a very good writer. The engineer was interested in literature, but that was not something that came accidentally. In fact, R.L. Stevenson was interested in literature since the very childhood. His natural inclination had been toward literature. So he might be an engineer by his formal education, but as far as his interest is concerned, he was a man, a lover of literature. He was inclined towards literature, and he eventually started writing seriously. So though a man, an engineer by profession or an engineer by education, the man started making his career in literary writing. He took the career of a writer quite seriously. You can see the house where he lived in his childhood, and the front of the house indicates that this man belonged to a well-to-do family. They had a very good house, and this is the pattern of the house that we find in England, Scotland, Ireland, etc. So Stevenson was a patient of tuberculosis, and this was the disease, TB. Tuberculosis is called TB. And this disease curtailed his life at the age of just 44. Now, during that time, we are talking of the later half of 19th century, and at that time, tuberculosis was an incurable disease. So a patient of tuberculosis was supposed to pass his days or his life in a warm climate. And as we know, England and Scotland, they are not warm countries. They are more on the colder side. So whenever there was cold in Scotland or England, it was necessary, or rather we can say compulsory, for Stevenson to move to a place which is warmer than the place where he is living. કે જ્યાં રહેતો હતો ત્યાં વધારે ઠંડી શરૂ થાય એટલે પોતાના ટીબીના રોગને વધારે ખરાબ ન થાય માટે એણે વધારે હૂંફાળી જગ્યાએ ખસવું પડતું હતું. So it was his illness, his disease, that made him travel from one place to another. But this writer, he always used those travels as the material of his writings. Whenever he went to some another place, he would collect certain things, collect certain material that can help him write about his journeys to these newer places. And those descriptions of those journeys, they were presented as different books. So his earliest works are descriptions of his journeys. For example, an inland voyage that came in 1878. Now this book, which was written in 1878, It was about a trip through Belgium and France in 1876. So he visited Belgium and France 2 years back, and then on the basis of that journey to Belgium and France, R.L. Stevenson wrote a book, and that book was titled An Inland Voyage, and that came in 1878. And then Travels with a Donkey in the Cevennes, that came in 1879, and it was about a journey on foot through mountains in southern France in 1878. તો એ 1878માં ફ્રાન્સના દક્ષિણ ભાગમાં આવેલા પર્વતો ઉપર પગે ચાલીને ફર્યા, અને એ જે એ ભમ્યા, એ ફર્યા, એ રખડપટ્ટી કરી, એના ઉપર, એના અનુભવો ઉપર એમણે એક પુસ્તક લખ્યું, અને પુસ્તકનું નામ હતું ટ્રાવેલ્સ વિથ અ ડોંકી ઇન ધ સેવનેસ, and that book came in 1879. In 1879, he traveled to California, where in 1880 he married Frances Osborne, an American divorcee. So he went to California in 1879. He was there in California up to 1880, and there he met an American divorcee named Frances Osborne, and he got married to that lady. તો આમ એક વિધવા સ્ત્રી ફ્રાન્સિસ ઓસ્બોર્ન સાથે 1880માં કેલિફોર્નિયામાં તેમણે લગ્ન કર્યા. Then he returned to Europe in 1880, but moved to Saranac Lake, New York in 1887. So this is how we can see that the man has been moving from one place to another. Perhaps he was interested in traveling a lot, and as we talked in the very first line, that he was forced to travel to warmer places because of his illness. In 1888, they sailed from San Francisco on a cruise across the South Pacific. દક્ષિણ પેસિફિક સમુદ્રમાં ક્રૂઝ એટલે જહાજમાં તેઓ સાન ફ્રાન્સિસ્કોથી મુસાફરી કરી. That was in 1888. In 1889, they settled in Samoa on the island of Upolu in a final effort to restore Stevenson's health, but he died there 5 years later. So they went to an island of Upolu. They thought that perhaps this island would be able to give them a proper, or rather provide him a proper atmosphere so that he can survive in a comfortable manner. But even that island also could not restore his health, and unluckily he died there in Upolu after 5 years, that is in 1895. This is a photograph where we find R.L. Stevenson sitting with his family members. Okay, let's move ahead. Stevenson's popularity is based primarily on the exciting subject matter of his adventure novels and fantasy stories. So we have discussed this a lot now, that he was forced and interested in traveling, and therefore he could make stories on the basis of his adventures, his travels, and he could also make certain fantasy stories as well. So the works, noticeable works by R.L. Stevenson are as under: Treasure Island, that was in 1883, is a swiftly paced story of a search for buried gold. In our Hindi film cinema and even in English, we find certain stories wherein the actors or the heroes and the group are supposed to go for some buried treasure, કોઈ દબાયેલો ખજાનો છુપાયેલો ખજાનો હોય એને શોધવા જતા હોય તો ટ્રેઝર આઇલેન્ડ that came in 1883, it's a swiftly paced story of a search for buried gold. સોનું શોધવાની વાર્તા ઉપરની એક સરસ વાર્તા છે, ઝડપથી ફાસ્ટ ચાલતી એવી એ વાર્તા છે. In the horror story, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that came in 1886, the extremes of good and evil appear startlingly in one character. In our Hindi films, we have seen such films, and Jekyll and Hyde is not a new name even for the readers of English literature. It is about not two different persons rather. It is about just one person who has got two sides of character. One is a good side, a gentle side of a person, and the other is an evil side. And that one person behaves in two different and completely opposite manners. That the horror story of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is about that. In fact, both the names, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, they are of the same character, but they indicate two different sides, two different opposite sides of one character. It's a very interesting and popular work. Then, in the same year, came Kidnapped. And this Kidnapped recounts the adventures of young David Balfour and the proud outlaw Alan Brake. So it is a story about two characters. One person is an outlaw. Outlaw means we can say a criminal. A gunegar છે. The name of that criminal is Alan Brake. And the other person is David Balfour, a younger person. And both of these characters pass through certain adventurous experiences. So this book, Kidnapped, talks about the adventures of these two characters. Stevenson's other adventure stories include The Black Arrow, that too in 1888, and The Master of Ballantrae, that came in 1889. So he has written a lot many stories or novels on this area of adventure and fantasy stories. Now, here is a picture, and that gives you some idea about the house where R.L. Stevenson stayed for his cure. You can see it here. This is the place where you find a house, and that was the house. You can see that the house is located nearby a river. It is in an area which is full of greenery. A lot of natural beauty is spread around, and even the atmosphere looks dry and sunny. So in a way we can say that R.L. Stevenson, who stayed here in this house, he had always to look for such places where he could restore his health. I can make you see the house in a better way. Yes, here it is. Okay, now this gives you some information about the suffering that the man had to undergo. let's move ahead. Stevenson wrote skillfully in a variety of genres. I told you earlier that he was not a person who restricted himself to writing only short stories or only one kind of literary form. He tried his hand on different literary forms. Of course, his bent was more on the prosaic side than the poetic side. But even then, he has tried his hand on poetry as well. So let's see how many literary forms did he try his hand on. He employed the forms of essay and literary criticism, and we are studying him as an essayist. He used to write essay, he used to write literary criticism, and the works regarding this essay and literary criticism are, as they are written here on the slide, in Virginibus Puerisque, that was in 1881, then Familius Studies of Man and Books, that came in 1882, and Memories and Portraits, that came in 1887. So these are the three works which we can categorize them as the works related to essay writing and literary criticism. Then he has also tried his hand, and we had discussed it in the earlier slides, that he was more interested in traveling. He was more interested in writing certain experiences that he got from his life, he got from the problems of his life, he got from the compulsions of his life. So travel and autobiographical pieces like The Silverado Squatters, that was in 1883, Across the Plains in 1892, and In the South Sea in 1896. So this book came in 1896. We can say it's a posthumous book that came into publication after his death. He tried his hand on poetry writing as well. A Child's Garden of Verses in 1885. It was one of the finest collections of poetry for children. Then he wrote two other collections, Underwoods in 1887 and Ballads in 1890. So he has contributed to the field of poetry writing as well. And then we move to short stories, and The New Arabian Nights, 1882. It is not The Arabian Nights, it is The New Arabian Nights. Arabian Nights is also one of the popular works in literature. So The New Arabian Nights, that came in 1882, and Island Nights Entertainments, that was in 1893. So these are the two collections of short stories. He also collaborated with his stepson, American writer Lloyd Osborne, in writing the novels The Wrong Box in 1889 and The Wrecker in 1892. તો પોતાના સાવકા પુત્ર એટલે પત્નીના આગળના પતિથી જન્મેલા દીકરા એવા સાવકા પુત્રને, જેનું નામ હતું લોઇડ ઓસ્બોર્ન, એની સાથે મળીને પણ બે નવલકથામાં એમણે પોતાનું ભાગ ભજવ્યો છે, અને એ બે નવલકથાઓ છે ધ રોંગ બોક્સ અને ધ રેકર. He died on 3rd December 1894, probably of a cerebral hemorrhage. So, he died of an accident. There was an hemorrhage. આપણે કે હેમરેજ થઈ ગયું છે, તો there was an hemorrhage, a kind of stroke, mental stroke જેવું હતું. અને we know that he was a sufferer. He had suffered a lot due to tuberculosis. So after that stroke, just after 4-5 years, just we can say some hours, just after a few hours, the man died, and at that time he was 44. But this man, though he lived a very short life, he lived quite happily. He enjoyed every moment of his life, and he always desired a very beautiful experiences in life, and that desire for the beautiful, that desire for the uh, uh, for something that can give him joy, that is seen in a small poetry written by himself, where he talks about the place where he should be buried, કે પોતાને ક્યાં દફનાવવો જોઈએ, મૃત્યુ પામે પછી કઈ જગ્યાએ દફનાવવો, એ બાબતને લઈને એમણે એક કવિતા લખી છે. અને પોતાના ઇન્સ્ક્રિપ્શનમાં શું લખવું, ઇન્સ્ક્રિપ્શન એટલે કે એમની જે ટોમ્બસ્ટોન હોય, એમની કબર હોય, એની ઉપરના પથ્થર ઉપર શું લખવું, એ બાબતની એક વાત છે. પણ એ પહેલાં હું તમને જણાવું કે વેર હી વોઝ બરીડ. So he was buried on a spot nearby Mount Weir, overlooking the sea, and that was his desire. So before he died, he had instructed the people that he should be buried at a place called Mount Weir. Mount Weir નામના પર્વત ઉપર, કે which was almost over a sea, કે એની બાજુમાં જ દરિયો હોય એટલે એવું લાગે કે પર્વત જાણે દરિયા ઉપર નજર રાખી રહ્યો છે, જોઈ રહ્યો છે. So he wanted people to bury him on that Mount Weir, and they followed his instructions. They fulfilled his desire. So let's look at the small poem. I'll just try to give you some meaning of the poem. He said, under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. કે વિશાળ આકાશની નીચે કબર ખોદજો ને મને ત્યાં નીચે સૂઈ રહેવા દેજો. Glad did I live and gladly die, કે હું આનંદથી જીવ્યો છું, હું આનંદથી મરવા માંગુ છું. And I laid me down with a will, અને હું મૃત્યુ પામું છું તો એ પણ એક સ્વેચ્છાએ. This be the verse you grave for me, here he lies where he longed to be. કે મારી કબર ઉપર એક પથ્થર લગાવો છો, ટોમ્બસ્ટોન જેને કહેવાય, એના ઉપર એક લખાણ છાપવાનું હોય છે, which is called inscription. So write on that inscription, this be the verse you grave for me, here he lies where he longed to be. કે અહીં એ માણસ સૂતો છે જેને અહીં સૂઈ રહેવાની ઈચ્છા હતી. Home is the sailor home from sea, and the hunter home from the hill. This is the home. This is the place. This is the last resort for the man who has lied here. He was a sailor who came to this last resort, who came to this home. He was a sailor who has returned from the sails all over the world, from the sea, we can say. કે આખી દુનિયામાં જે ભટક્યો છે એના માટે આ ઘર છે, અહીંયા સૂતો છે. આ એ જ માણસ છે કે જે આખા વિશ્વમાં બધે પર્વતોમાં જાણે કે શિકારે ફર્યો છે. શિકાર એ કોઈ પક્ષીઓના કે પ્રાણીઓના શિકાર માટેની વાત નથી. But he was always looking for a better, warmer place. The man who always wanted to live in quite gladly, who always wanted to enjoy a life, such a lively man, died at a very, very, very tender age, or we can say at least not at the age that a person should die. He died at just 44. Otherwise, he would have contributed a lot for the lovers of literature. Okay. I think this acquaintance on RL Stevenson has provided you some information about RL Stevenson, and I think you will be able to understand about his life, about his contributions, and about his nature as well. We shall meet some other time discussing some other topic. Thank you.